know her was to know Jesus Christ, I think, and we celebrate, and we'll talk more about her. So I thought, what am I going to talk to you about? I'm going to talk to you about death. But that death is but another step into the next chapter of our lives. And that's important for us to see. And Rosie always knew that. And if you talk to her very long, you always can see that as she celebrated life. And I went to 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 3. It says, Then David took an oath again and said, Your father certainly knows that I found favor in your eyes. And he has said, Do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death. And this scripture is about Jonathan and David, who later becomes king, is so close to King Saul's son, Jonathan. They're like brothers. And they have such a close relationship. And for those of you that had that kind of relationship with Rosie, you understand very clearly what that was like. But David also knew that his life was in danger because King Saul wanted to kill him. And so he always knew that there was but one step between him and death. And that death could come at any time. And certainly, as we have walked this walk with Rosie, especially this past year, we know how precarious it was. And I tell you, at times, I always felt like she's going to do this. This is going to happen. God's going to heal her. And he did indeed heal her, because the ultimate healing is to go to heaven. But to realize that, to see her hope and her faith throughout all of the things that she went through was always amazing to me. And it was so hard to see her on that last day and to realize that I might not see her again. I know I had planned to go back the next day, but the Lord chose to take her before that. So the first thing you see as you look at this is a new chapter, is a step that we all must take. Every one of us is going to face this one day. And we don't know when that's going to happen. It could be this day, it could be 10 years from now, it could be 20, 30, 40 years from now. But we need to be prepared for that. And her first chapter began in Devon, Manchester, Jamaica. And I was looking at pictures from Jamaica. What a beautiful place it must have been. But she was very little when she moved, but had gotten back there a few times. When I first met Rosie, I met her as I came to the church here. The first funeral I had here was for her mother. But to know Rosie was to know her mother. To know her mother was to know Rosie. Two wonderful, wonderful Christian women. And then her last chapter ended here in Hackensack. And so much happened in between, though. Even though her life wasn't as long as we would have liked it, think of all the experiences she had, all the people that she impacted, all the people she knew. Growing up, graduating, it was so wonderful to see someone from Eastside here to represent her class. And her training at the University of Pace and at New York University, and then on to work. And she liked to talk about her work and all the things that she did, and the people that she met, and the people that she worked with, and how wonderful that was. But we realize that none of us has the power over death. The writer of Ecclesiastes, when you go to Ecclesiastes, you immediately think about that time for everything. Well, that time is also for death, and that none of us have the power in the day of death. The writer of Ecclesiastes says in chapter 8, one man years ago had visited Portugal on an evangelistic tour, and he was delighted to find a lot of believers there who were really spiritual giants. Among them was a missionary from Great Britain named Eric Barker. And Eric Barker had spent over 50 years in Portugal and preaching the gospel under very adverse conditions at times. And during World War II, the situation got so critical that Barker was advised to send his wife and 8 children back home to England. And so he put them on a boat along with his sister and her 3 children, and they had to go back to England for safety. But on the Lord's Day following their departure, he stood before his congregation and he said this. He said, "I just received word that all my family have arrived safely home." And then he went on and proceeded with the service as usual. But later, the full meaning of his words became very clear to the people of that church, because he learned that while they were en route, the ship that they were on had been torpedoed, and all of his family had perished. But he knew that they were all believers. He knew that they had all gone to heaven, and that they were in, as the psalmist writes, a more desired haven. And so even though he was overwhelmed with grief, he was able to rise above the circumstances by the grace of God. And when I heard that story, I immediately thought of Rosie, because that was her. No matter what she went through, one thing after another. I could be sitting in my office, and I had been going through some problems myself, and next thing you know, the phone rang, and I saw it was her, and I picked up the phone, and before I could say, "Rosie, how are you?" she'd ask me how I was. And that's the way she was. Not calling to get sympathy or anything else. She had such strength. And we can only pray for that kind of strength. And I can say to you today that Roseanne Lewis is safely home. And then you look at this new chapter, and you realize, starting with death, it's a step that has unknown timing. We don't know when our time is going to be. as I went to visit her in the hospital the night before, when I walked in, if she was sleeping at first, I thought, you know what? Normally I won't wake somebody up, but I said, I need to wake her up. I needed to know I'm here. And so I said, Roseanne, and it didn't take much, and she opened her eyes, and she had a oxygen mask on, and she looked at me with those big eyes, and she smiled. And I said, Roseanne, I want to pray with you, and I want to read you some scriptures. And so I shared some scriptures with her, and we prayed. And then she gave me another smile, and then she drifted back off again. But it was so wonderful to see her that one last time, and to see that smile, and to feel that strength that she has. And we know that all of us are going to face that one day. And we know that the timing is never perfect. We always say they've always been taken too soon. But God's time is always right. God's time is always perfect. And then as you look at this new chapter, starting with death, you realize it's a parting step. That's probably the hardest part for all of us. It's a parting step. But realize this, for believers, it's a temporary step. That one day we're all going to be reunited again. And that's a step that I really look forward to. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6, it says, so we are always confident, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. But Paul also says that when we're absent from the body, that we're present with the Lord. And that's the promise that we live with and that we have. You know, there are many people in our world today that don't believe. And Voltaire was one of those people, probably history's best-known atheist. And he often stated this. He said, by the time I'm buried, the Bible will be non-existent. And his last words were this, I am abandoned by God and man. I shall die and go to hell alone. Can you see the contrast in the statements he makes? His condition actually became so terrible that his associates were afraid to even go to his bedside. And when he passed away, his nurse said all the wealth in Europe, she would never watch another atheist die because of the horrible way in which he went. And it's interesting, a few years later, that the Geneva Bible Society actually came in and bought Voltaire's home and began to print Bibles out of that home. Now, taking contrast, another well-known minister, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, German theologian, he was standing in front of a firing squad during World War II. And he was there because he had been speaking out against Nazism. And this is what he said, this may seem to be the end for me, but it's just the beginning. And that's